everyone. Welcome to Designing Science, the IndieBio podcast. I'm Arvind Gupta, your host and the founder of IndieBio. I'm here to help share the secrets and tales from the frontiers of biotechnology. IndieBio enables the world's best scientists to build radically innovative companies. This podcast is for you. Welcome everyone to another episode of Designing Science with IndieBio. I'm Arvind Gupta, your host, founder of IndieBio, and with me today is Dr. Joon Yoon. We are thrilled to have Dr. Joon Yoon join us. He is the managing director of Palo Alto Investors, a board-certified radiologist, and the founding sponsor of the National Academy of Medicine Healthy Longevity Grand Challenge Prize. Also the sponsor of the Palo Alto Prize for Longevity, the Salk Institute trustee, and well known for coming up with a theory of homeostatic capacity as a biomarker for aging and the ability to control our health. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me, Arvind. I'm excited.
Absolutely. And so, the whole idea of homeostatic capacity is fascinating to me. I heard it in your TED Talk, and that's not what we're going to talk about today.
Well, it's a fun subject, and I think people can hear about it elsewhere.
Yeah.
But I look forward to talking about lots of other stuff with you.
Yeah, and some of the things that we were discussing, really that I think is on the real cutting edge of what's happening, is where is longevity going? This idea of our age or the symptoms of aging being something that is potentially controllable or manageable. And so I guess one of the things that is starting to really become apparent is around reproductive longevity. Can you tell me what that means and kind of elaborate on that a little?
Sure. So, just as modern medicine was getting going in the 50s, there were a couple of notions related to aging that got us in the path for the next several decades. One of them was the idea that senescence can only weakly be reflected in selection. That was Peter Medawar. So people stopped thinking about selection as something that had some plasticity, that it was a trait that was modifiable. And to me, that's good news, because that means we actually haven't tested those frameworks in a long time. So now that we have all this molecular biology, now we know the code of life through DNA, let's see if we can actually find the codes of life to edit out some of the senescence pathways, if they exist. We don't know. We're just, the idea is to go look for them. The same is true in the idea of reproductive senescence. So since 1951, it's known as Zuckerman's hypothesis. We've been led to believe that we're born with a certain number of eggs, and then once you run out, you're now infertile. So that's been the dominant framework for 6 decades.
I've heard that myself, yes.
Right. And a few people have challenged that, but by and large, that remains a dogma. Now, the cost of being wrong about Zuckerman's hypothesis is vast. What if actually there is plasticity to ovarian senescence? The upside for humanity and for women is incredible, because right now, the fact that the ovary ages out, that's the second biologic clock, right? We probably have this global biologic clock called longevity, and there's a smaller biologic clock for women around their ovaries. What if that clock could be modified? Because right now, the fact that the ovaries senesce out in our 40s affects and forces so many decisions for people and women that they might not make. So if you actually are able to modify that, you return that freedom to women to be able to make social, professional, personal choices that they would want to. So I think the fact that that hasn't been tried in so long means that it is an area for potential innovation that is very exciting and socially transformative.
Right. Almost, as big as the birth control pill.
Exactly.
Right.
Exactly.
Amazing.
Exactly.
Yeah. And so as people start to live longer, when we start thinking about, longevity, we are actually making decisions to have children later and later in life. What is it? A lot of people are worried, right? We're going to overpopulate. If everyone lives to be 150, 200 years old, what does that mean for our population?
Right. I mean, it's an understandable concern because demography is a function of death rate, birth rate, reproductive rate, and the second half of the last century, we were operating under Malthusian fears. It was really Paul Ehrlich who wrote the book Population Bomb, and even even Malthus was echoing Benjamin Franklin from a century before. This whole idea that demography is a major consideration in policy, politics, social change, economics. So Paul's book was published in '67, and it really, I think, spooked policymakers into thinking, oh my God, if population keeps expanding, it's going to be a problem. Ironically, the year he published the book ended up being the peak population growth rate around the world, and it's been going down ever since. But the meme lives on. So the Earth is full and getting too crowded remains the dominant framework. It's the way we think about resources. Like we are now trying to conserve resources. We're trying to, people even go to war over resources, oil, natural resources. But the good news is that even though that's the prevailing opinion, that the Earth is too full, the empirical evidence is exactly the opposite. So as society transitions to longevity, all of the high longevity countries have fertility rate under replacement rate. That's stunning. So you can classify it in a number of ways, but about 40% of the world lives in highly prosperous, high longevity countries. That's almost half the world. And all of them have fertility rate under replacement rate.
Why do you think that is? What's driving the fact that you're having fewer kids than you have the capacity to?
It's the aggregate sum of a lot of different inclinations, and social scientists have studied this. It could be because you have a longer runway, you need to get educated further, which delays fertility. Maybe you need to plan for a longer retirement, you need to work harder. There's many reasons. There's a couple of new ones I've introduced into the social science space. Well, I'll just maybe focus on one. It's really about relationships in many ways, and we forget because our survivorship is so high now that until recently, mortality rates were very high across your whole lifespan. So your infant mortality rate was high, mortality rate till puberty was, let's just say, half. You'd probably lose half your siblings. By the time you were 13, one or both of your parents were dead. And hopefully you meet somebody and have 7 kids, and half of them might make it, and you're dead at 22. So that was the template. And so you lived and made decisions around your relations around that template. And that's why when you're 13, you really got to get going. You got about 9 years left. Juliet was 13 when she hooked up with Romeo. We don't know Romeo's age. Shakespeare never said. So it made sense to start reproducing at 13 because you got 9 years left. Now, so people were saying "I do" to each other at 13, and if you make a bad call, it's only 9 years of hell. Not a big price if you're wrong. But now, do you really want to say "I do" at 13? Because not that the expected lifespan is 80. Somebody born today could live to 100. At 13, you're like, you know what? 87 years with you? I'm not sure. I think I want to do more due diligence. So most people now, when they hit 13, they don't get married. They're sort of in sampling mode, and then sample till you're through your 20s and 30s, and then next thing you know, you got the biological clock ticking. You might have time for one kid, and then you move on. So longevity actually leads to deferral of life history decisions such as mating, which actually is leading to defertility, which tends to reduce population growth rate to the point of stability and possibly even depopulation. Imagine if the numerator of all of this human activity starts going down. The head count starts reducing. That's not priced in anybody's model right now.
It's a fascinating theory and well reflected in the data that we do know, right? Japan's fertility rates, national fertility rates, have been dropping, and famously, some governments are incentivizing having children because they see it as a national security threat.
Absolutely.
And the predominant theory was, you're right, too many kids is too much of a drain. So, China put a cap on the number of kids you could have at one, right? And then recently took that off as they hit prosperity. It's quite interesting. So where does that go then? If we're if we're actually now living to say, children born today, 100 years old, and a lot more of that age functional, not, half of it being functional, right? Because I think that's, again, we can get into that in a little bit, but like, what drives a behavior if it's 50 years of not very functional and you're in a retirement home and not enjoying life in the same capacity as you were when you were 30, does that drive the change in the behavior? Or like,
I think so. I'm going to pull a couple of comments out of that.
Yeah,
so
please.
I'll address that one first.
Yeah.
I've always thought about the narrative of healthcare as exactly wrong. I don't think we have a healthcare problem. We have a disease problem. Healthcare is a solution. And when you talk to people as they start, they've accumulated all these memes and wisdom and experience, and their body starts going down. So exactly when they should be hitting their peak is when they're getting undermined. So imagine the value unlocked by making people healthier. Healthier people, I think, create wealth. They create prosperity, and then prosperous communities consume more health. So to me, it's a virtuous cycle. So the idea is to push the curve out of productivity and potential so that people can do more with their life, enhanced function. That's why we're calling it functional longevity. It's not just longevity, but functional longevity, which includes your mental performance, professional performance, all those things, relationship performance, as a way to expand the value. So I think that's the opportunity of healthcare. The other point I wanted to just address, since you brought it up, is the fact that demography is going to start to affect policy. We're in a transition phase where the first world is, population growth rate is declining to below replacement rate, but the remainderment, the 60%, which are the emerging countries with low longevity, they're still supplying us talent. So we're kind of mischaracterizing this era. We should be thinking about it as, oh my God, we're in the human capital century. The most valuable resources are not natural, it's human. And in that setting, you think about immigration very differently. Think about other countries, people, immigrants as human capital that wants to come to your country. So you don't want to be a bad country because people don't want to come to you. If you don't offer citizenship, then people are not going to choose you, they're going to go elsewhere. So once people wake up to the fact that we're in the human capital century, they will compete to be the best country they can to attract people and to try to keep people. So we don't want to build walls to keep people out. We don't even want to build it to keep people in. We just want to be great. So imagine an environment where countries compete to be awesome. I think that's the world we're heading into. But during this transition phase, it doesn't feel that way. We're kind of mischaracterizing what all this human migration is all about.
It's an interesting question. So what are the dimensions of greatness, do you think? Like what will the competition field look like? Is it over access to capital? Is it access? What will differentiate the countries from each other for, let's say, a superstar scientist or any immigrant that could go anywhere?
I think you could characterize it as a million different things, but I'm just going to simplify it as it's where people are going to go to chase their dreams.
And so the country that can enable that the best is the one that wins. And historically, the United States has done that in an incredible way. For my parents as well.
Exactly. People underestimate, as an immigrant, how much America is respected and valued elsewhere. I mean, it's stunning to look at America from the outside when you're young. I mean, the whole idea that they even do, they deflate international security for the rest of the world. It's stunning. The fact that you go to war to improve the lives of other people. I mean, that is like this mind-boggling. And we forget to appreciate that. So from the outside, you can see it. From the inside, we're not perfect. There's a lot of things that we're not doing right. But by and large, is a country that is unprecedented as a civilization.
That's really neat and absolutely true and of the times. And I agree with you on that, on those policies. I do worry about, we fund a lot of scientists from overseas and, bringing them to the United States and helping them with the visas and all that kind of stuff. For us, I mean, it's incredibly important for innovation within the biotech industry and across all of technology as an industry. So hopefully that will continue to go the way it has been. So bringing it back a little bit to actual kind of the science of biology and stuff like that, as we are starting to rethink what is medicine, I think I'm very excited by a lot of the reframing of fundamental assumptions Um, and so when you start thinking about food and nutrition, that's been something for me that has been a big frustration, because I feel like with all the money that's been spent on science and our human knowledge, we know so little about nutrition and how it actually affects us. Sugar is good for you, sugar is bad for you, fat's good for you, fat's bad for you, right? Like carbs are great, carbs are terrible. What is going on? Where are we going to go in that? Do you have any thoughts on that?
I have some thoughts.
Yeah.
It's an area of personal curiosity.
Yeah.
Maybe just kind of tell you the story of how I entered my current interest in nutrition. So I've long wondered if if food is not only calories and nutrition, but if it's informatics. Like, are we actually learning about the world through what we eat? So think about what you eat as content. And if food is content, what is it telling us? I was looking at like iodine. Iodine is, the thyroid hormone, which is made of iodine. So why does a dietary component affect your hormonal levels that has a small effect on so many important life history decisions, such as how many kids you have, male-female ratio, metabolic rate, lifespan? That's all dietary. So it's almost like your body's reading the environment through your food. And if so, what is the environment saying to us right now? So from what I can tell about what we've done to the supply chain of what we eat over the last 50 years, we've stressed it out. Their stress hormones are high. Animals and plants now animals express high cortisol. They're diabetic, they're hypertensive, they're obese. Plants have high ethylene. And isn't it interesting, when we eat an animal that has got a stress phenotype, we take on the stress phenotype. We end up with obesity, hypertension, diabetes. So I wonder, are we what we eat? Are we assuming the phenotype of what's ahead of us? To me, that's evolutionarily adaptive. I like looking at everything from an evolutionary lens. It actually makes sense for you to, because you're never quite sure. We are all like kind of followers.
Yeah,
we always want to follow what the others are saying and not in the environment because they're reading it for us. So if you're a line in the food chain and everything ahead of you has got high stress hormones, you should probably take on the phenotype too, because people are reading nature on your behalf. It's like reading the weather map, right? So the greatest source of stress in nature is winter. It's getting drier, colder. Right. So stress hormones go up seasonally, and you're supposed to have seasonal obesity as a function of high stress hormones. Like, you're all supposed to fatten up for the winter.
Right.
But now animals are stressed in the supply chain, not because it's winter, it's because of our industrial conditions, the way we treat animals. And isn't it interesting? We're now obese all year long. So we may be taking on an adaptive function of seasonal stress phenotypes and turned into a permanent phenotype, and they called it obesity or diabetes or hypertension.
It's a very, very different hypothesis around, most people say, oh, well, you're obese because you're eating too much, right?
Yeah.
Rather than you're obese because you're eating animals that were stressed and therefore putting on fat to prepare for the winter, and those growth factors are actually entering your body and activating your own metabolism or slowing it down to put on fat for you for the winter.
Yeah, exactly.
Phenomenal theory. I mean, I'd love to see, chase that down.
So chasing it down is what got me to this. By the way, I have a fundamental problem with all those calorie studies because I'm glad they measure what went in, but they should also be measuring what went out of the other end of the pipe. You should be measuring net calories, not gross.
Yes.
And so I know it's gross to measure what comes out the other side, but to me, net is what matters.
Yeah.
So it's an example of, I think the science out there is just very low grade. I think we could do a whole lot better. And they just stay on this a little bit too. Plants also express a lot of stress hormones. And it's amazing how little we know about it. So the stress hormones of plants is ethylene, C2H4. It's the second simplest hydrocarbon on the planet. I was never taught about it in biochemistry class. Most people I know have never heard of it.
It's a growth hormone, right?
It's a stress hormone. It has
Okay,
all the physiologic effects that cortisol has, but does it in plants.
In plants. Okay, great.
But it's also industry produced at a level 109 million metric tons. It's the most synthesized chemical on the planet for industrial use.
Sure.
So we're mass producing stress hormones and putting it on the ecosystem. I mean, how do we know we're not actually stressing out the entire ecosystem?
Yeah.
How do we know we're not inflaming the ecosystem? So ethylene, I think, deserves further study.
Ethylene gas in general, over a forest, let's say.
And then exactly. Yeah. You know, in fact, in a forest, I always like to think about teleology. Why did plants adopt ethylene as their stress hormone? And you know, and it's just, I don't know, I'm writing these narratives post hoc, but I think it's because the greatest form of stress in nature is oxidation. Oxidation is the combination of oxygen and a spark, and that's essentially what fire is. So, I mean, people don't think about what is the smoke and fire. It's basically hydrocarbon fragments. A big chunk of it is ethylene. So the greatest source of stress for a forest is actually fire. So the fact that smoke is coming up is an alarm call for the whole forest, and the effects of ethylene is rapid flowering, rapid senescence, drop your fruit, obsession, sweeten, because plants are sedentary. They can't run away, but the way they run away is having this commensal relationship with animals. Give them the fruit and your seeds run, so it allows dispersion. So to me, it's an escape hatch. It's a way to escape the greatest threat, which is fire. Anyway, that's just a little narrative. I looked at whether or not ethylene consumption affects human function, and it turns out nobody's studying it. It hasn't been studied since the 20s. So I started to talk to food scientists about just the curiosity, like, what do you know, and why do we know so little? And in the process, what I learned is that they also have unbelievably interesting questions that have remained unstudied. They also were sharing all sorts of conflicting data that was different than the popular memes. So I asked all of them to come out to San Francisco, and they disagreed on stage together in front of 200 food stakeholders and media. Sugar, whether you should eat, peanuts early, late. I mean, all that stuff. There's a dissenting opinion, and I just want the public to see that what is being sold as truth is actually contentious. And this is the reason why it feels like dietary recommendations are so contradictory and flip-flopping, and it's because the science is not strong. Now, at the end of the conference, I took a break, went on some long walks, and really thought through what is the nature of the problem. So here's the way I repackaged my understanding of the problem. These food scientists have essentially no place to turn to for funding that is dedicated to just nutrition. So nutrition is not a primary focus for any federal agency. There's a little bit of money at the NIH, NSF, CDC, FDA, and USDA, but most of the funding actually comes from industrial sources. So in a way, it's great that industry stepped into this funding gap, but as a public, we can't depend on private interests in science for truth over the long haul.
It's way too biased.
Yeah, I mean, 93% of sponsored studies conclude in favor of the sponsor. So those are just the numbers, right? I don't think the intention is to do that, but I mean, that's just the outcome.
It's just a bias.
And I believe that at all times we need a second point of view on everything. I think oracles are dangerous. I think you always need a second dissenting point of view. I wrote a paper called Mimetic Parallax to really describe this phenomenon of the fact that nature always wants to divide us into at least two points of views because it's dangerous to maintain a single point of view. So while it doesn't feel good to be living in an environment where people disagree, to me this is a feature of life, not a bug. In radiology, there's a known concept. This is only exists in radiology. It's called parallax. So a one-eyed radiologist has trouble picking up findings such as a tumor, as well as a two-eyed radiologist. When you have a second point of view from a slightly different angle, things pop out more. You get better resolution. So that's known as parallax. Now, apply that thinking to social looks at things. So I always believe that the first thing that will happen after world peace is civil war, because you're going to always fragment into multiple points of views again because you don't want consensus thinking. Nature doesn't want it. So from a multi-level selection perspective, the minute the superorganism senses consensus, it divides us. So after the Treaty of Versailles, quickly balkanized, right? After the Second World War II, quickly balkanized. This, I think, is the reason why males, all species, all advanced species, divide into male and female. Males and females have slightly different agendas. We're looking for different things. And because we look at things differently, we actually are better off to get a second look at everything. How do you raise a child? Males and females think differently. To me, this is a feature of life, not a bug.
Sure.
The most important thing is trust and respect. If there's trust and respect, dissenting points of views are extremely enabling in terms of picking the right memes. When there's no trust and respect, it feels awful. And you get a little bit of that with the blue-red debate right now, right? To me, it's a feature that social evolution would divide us into capitalism, socialism, red and blue. But when there's no trust and respect, people will start battling So I think that's the main thing to focus on is trust and respect. But the fact that we disagree, to me, is a feature of life. Now, in science too, I think we need a second point of view, not just industrial point of view, but public point of view. And to me, it's a policy lag error to not have created a federal agency dedicated to nutrition, given the fact that nutrition has been demonstrated to play a role in virtually all chronic diseases. Chronic diseases account for $900 billion out of the $1.1 trillion HHS budget. So, it's crazy. The total amount of federal funding for food research right now is $1.5 billion. If you cobble together all the RFPs, so $1.5 billion in the face of $900 billion in chronic diseases.
It's unbelievable.
We spent $50 billion on candy alone. Right. So it's like rounding error what we spend on nutrition. So I think that gap, represents an opportunity.
Interesting.
The policy lag errors, not only that, but also the fact that right now nutrition is in the domain of USDA, but USDA's mission is to protect the interests of farmers and growers and producers. So I think nutrition makes more sense under HSS than Department of Ag. So Department of Health and Human Services instead of Department of Ag, to put it in the more proper department. When Department of Ag was formed by Lincoln, it made sense because we were agrarian, we were growing our own food. But now that health is a separate issue from growing, I think these should be separate agencies and full dedication to each. USDA can just focus on the growers, and National Institute of Nutrition is, what I'm hoping that it will be named under HSS, can just be dedicated to public health. And we're only asking for $5 billion. That's kind of the idea. I think it feels like it's a cost in the national budget, but to me, not having a National Institute of Nutrition is far more expensive because then you have to balloon out treating the diseases, right? The money for diseases.
Well, it's interesting, right? I think if you push food to its logical end in what it does in functionality, you can see it, and it has been both preventative in terms of disease as well as curative in terms of disease. You can see that. I was traveling through South America and Peru, and and in Vietnam, we living with villagers. They'll go to the fields to pull something because you twisted your ankle or have a headache. Traditional Chinese medicine is food as medicine. How do you believe, or do you have an opinion on food as medicine in a Western framework?
Well, absolutely. We are entirely composed of what we ate. So it can both be enabling and disabling. I think we need to sort out which is which. And food as medicine as a field is taking off right now. We just need better data.
Well, how do you think we regulate that, right? So like if you go to Safeway and you see, this food is shown clinically to treat or reduce this type of cancer, let's say. How does that, the claims get crazy very fast,
Very
right?
important point. I think the public will catch on to the fact that for a drug to get on the market, it has to show safety and efficacy. FDA was an incredible innovation. And FDA also regulates food, but these are generally regarded as safe. So it's mostly about safety and labeling.
That's right.
So the health claims are very soft. You don't need to do rigorous trials, and that's the rub on food science right now.
Right.
It's more of a FDA and FTC issue more of an FTC issue than an FDA issue. Are these companies behaving? Are their claims appropriate? And that's a very different hurdle. The hurdle is too low. But given the fact that now we know that food can be a source of health and disease, we need to set higher standards because the public excels at getting duped by counterparties, right? We see that in the media right now.
Right.
And food science was the original fake news. We are essentially eating counterparty risk.
Right.
And again, as we enter the 21st century, it is not good that we know so little about food. So I'm not here to advocate any one point of view about food. The main thing is, I think the right answer to most questions is, I don't know. And when it comes to food, most people say, I know. How many people have you seen at a food panel, they say, I know, when they should be saying, I don't know.
Right.
It may be decades before we even know the truth about a lot of these things. Like carcinogenicity, it's going to take years. So the payoff's not going to be immediate. So I think we have to be patient. First of all, even forming one of these things, I think it's going to take forever. The NCI, National Cancer Institute, it took 30 years to get that established.
Yeah, it's unbelievable.
So as much as I would like to see the National Institute of Nutrition happen, I'm prepared for the fact that this is a long shot, that we're not going to be successful. That doesn't deter me at all, the fact that it's a long shot.
Of course not.
But I want the public to understand that this isn't a quick fix. This isn't like we're going to do a study and quickly find out what you're supposed to eat. No, this is like we're gonna finally start to learn what we didn't know in the first place.
Yeah, that's very, very cool. And so, I mean, we know that diet is a big part of many of the biggest killers in the country, right? Cardiovascular disease, stroke, things like that. You have a very interesting viewpoint on cardiovascular disease and stroke. So I'd like you to share some of that.
Yeah. So I mean, heart disease. I was gonna say that heart disease doesn't exist. I don't really mean that, but let me ask you this question. Heart disease doesn't exist in nature. What's the most common cause of death in nature? Like, what do fish dive in the ocean?
Another animal eats. Yeah, another fish eats.
Exactly. I've had so many interesting answers to that question of what do fish dive in the ocean? Alzheimer's, heart disease.
What? Another fish eats
aging,
them, or a human catches them.
One person's that drowning. Well, so that the fact that we don't think about predators is a way we anthropomorphize our own lives onto the animal kingdom. So we almost never die from predators.
Sure.
Our survivorship is near 100% per meal.
Yeah.
On an average meal, we're the one doing the eating.
Right.
But in nature, if you aggregate the risk across all the animals, the carnivores, the mortality rate per meal is 50%. Literally every meal you're either going to eat or be eaten.
Yeah, right. Good point.
Trauma is the #1 driver of natural selection. If you can survive a predatory attack and go on to reproduce, your genes will be very popular. So we're the survival bias of 4 billion years of successful Houdini acts. Right? So here's what happens when we're under traumatic stress. You have an injury of any type. Your body doesn't try to determine how severe it is. It just executes the factory setting response. It's like just like when you dial 911, the cops, ambulance, and firemen all show up. Whether it's a cat stuck in a tree or multiple homicide, they all come, right? It's same with our trauma response. Our physical response is any injury, leg bitten off to the smallest one, it activates inflammation, coagulation, and vasoconstriction.
Right.
Okay, small letter paper cut, inflammation, vasoconstriction, and coagulation because you got exsanguination and you got bugs coming in. Life-saving in the wild, in this context of predators, but in the context of modern life, is maladaptive. The new source of injury to our blood vessels is diabetes, hypertension, stroke. I'm sorry, stress, hypertension. And our bodies can't distinguish these novel sources of trauma from the legacy sources of trauma, so it executes the same factory setting response. The blood vessel is exposed to diabetes and hypertension. It'll start narrowing, constricting, and inflaming. That's all a heart attack is. It has nothing to do with the heart. It's a evolutionary dysfunction, a misapplication of an old response. Now, unfortunately, medicine right now doesn't see this as evolutionary disease. It just sees it as a plumbing problem. So you take this narrow, tight, inflamed artery and you open it up with a balloon, which solves the flow problem, but it actually causes more injury than the original injury. So now there's a crush injury in the blood vessels, which is why the risk of collapse is high. Now we have, instead of rethinking our framework, we just named a new disease after angioplasty. It's called restenosis. And we started leaving metal cages behind for many decades now. The metal cages are called stents, but they're deployed by a balloon, so that also causes injury. So the factory setting response is to inflame, coagulate, constrict. So instead of rethinking our framework, we just now put drugs and radiation on these things. So it's really, to me, it's a framework problem. It is a maladaptation of a evolutionary response, not heart disease. Same with stroke. The biggest sensor in our body is the carotids. There's a bifurcation of the carotids that carotid arteries, along with the vertebral artery, will feed the brain, and your body, you need enough blood pressure to get blood to your brain. Now, there's a sensor. Sensors are generally placed in the crotches of bifurcations. There's a reason why airplanes have in a Pateau tube, they put the sensor right on the crotch so you can regulate flow. Now, as we end up with thickening of our arteries, I tend to think about this as a information transfer problem. So the more hypertensive we are, the thicker the wall, but then the thicker the wall, the information sensor under-senses the high blood pressure. So you're now hypertensive inside the wall, but outside the wall your blood pressure is too low. So the sensor sends the wrong signal, which is to increase your blood pressure further, which is now a feed-forward cycle in hypertension. So this is not how carotid disease is viewed by medicine today. Today they see it as a narrow, thickened artery, and they put a stent in there. Well, the stent I understand it increases flow, but now you've now increased the reporting error from inside the vessel to the outside the vessel, because now the sensor can't feel the pressure as much. So again, this is an example of, I think one of the early days of modern medicine.
Yeah, and I agree. I mean, I think for the first time we're understanding the complexity of the systems we're playing with, both biologically within our own body, but also the overlap between the biology in our own bodies and our environments, with methylations in our DNA being able to be passed on potentially, being demonstrated in early experiments. So, as we start to understand cancer as being a deeply complicated set of signaling pathways and getting to a true cure being exceedingly difficult. So as we're starting to understand it, do you have any, where do you see us being able to actually deal with stroke and heart disease and cancers and things like that if they are exceedingly complex?
Well, so I like to look at the complex landscape and see what the underlying rules are. So it's really, in the strata problems, you should always figure out what the first order problem is. If you operate at the order of a second level, you're probably treating the symptom, and you're only going to cause third order problems. So I think most of the world right now lives in the second order problem sets, not only in biology, but socially, economically. We're almost always treating the symptoms. That's why we keep creating tertiary problems. So figure out what the first order problem is. So the first order problem to me in biology is that we lose homeostatic capacity at 40. What I mean by that is at the cellular and molecular level, and certainly at the organism level, your signal to response no longer has 100% fidelity. You start underperforming relative to demand. And then, of course, as that scales, you end up with diabetes and hypertension, in my opinion. So I'm really curious as to why does your signal to response no longer maintain 100% fidelity? Is it a loss of control systems, loss of clocks, loss of power? Is the mitochondrial insufficient? Is everything in the signal cascade underphosphorylated, and therefore the response is inadequate? That alone could account for all the different features of aging. So then I'm interested in why does your feedback loop to maintain 100% fidelity decline? And then if you can fix that, maybe everything will snap back to the grid. Maybe all the functions still operate, and this is now a systems disintegration problem. So if you do systems integration, you ought to be able to bring people back from these various lag errors that they're reporting right now. So that's the way I would think about medicine. You have a self-curing system. It's the greatest system ever invented, is your own health. Works for about 40 years. The warranty runs out. The body can no longer maintain homeostatic capacity. We create a $3 trillion story around it called healthcare, whack-a-mole, and then we die. That's a short history of life. What if we could put that system back in the body, though? Instead of externalizing homeostatic capacity, which actually induces atrophy and drug dependency, put the system back in the body. Be able to get back to near 100% fidelity of signal response. Then you're now robust longer, functional longer, and then you unlock the human potential. So that's really what this is all about. People say, is this about longevity? No. The current system is about longevity. It doesn't need any more money. We're already spending $3 trillion a year trying to extend your longevity without solving anything.
It's a good point.
So please don't support longevity. Please support functional longevity. The goal here is to end healthcare, to end aging. Ending aging is ending healthcare as we know it. And people can focus on other things besides trying to prop up the system. So I think the way we're going is the least interesting way. Everybody benefits a little bit from the current system. Doctors are a little bit happy, patients, insurance companies, pharmaceutical companies. But good is the enemy of great, and we're stuck in this adaptive valley where we can't see that there's a much better solution set elsewhere, because everything looks uphill from here, so therefore we must have found the best valley. But sometimes you got to go against the grain, have courage and resources to get back to another point of view we can see across other landscapes. This is an evolutionary theory concept of other landscapes, to see if there's a much greener valley elsewhere that no one's even thought about.
And maybe even a bigger global maximum.
Exactly. So that's what the funding's about, is to provide the uphill momentum. Palo Prize and the National Academy is to just get to a new vantage point.
That's great.
And then let's relook at everything.
So where do you see, so call it 50 years from now, 100 years from now, you could take your pick. Do I get sick anymore? What does healthcare look like? I mean, it's a compelling vision, right? That sickness is gone, right?
No, there are always, so if you think about homeostatic capacity as your capacity to recover from stress, there are always extenuating stressors that you cannot overcome on your own. Slings and arrows of life, Hamlet. So until 1800, until 1950 actually, the predominant cause of death were trauma and infection. That's what used to clean everybody out. If you look at the mortuary descriptions. So we will always have that. The rate of trauma and infection taking people out, even until age 40, is about 0.2%. And then these chronic causes of death come out, and it's geometrically rising by 120. Mortality rate per year is 100%. So now imagine if you can maintain mortality rates even at a 40-year-old, which is 0.2%. How long would you be able to live if you can maintain a mortality rate of 0.2%? 500 years, right?
Yep.
So to me, lifespan, if you can solve for homeostatic capacity, then you ought to be able to maintain low mortality rates that are trauma, slings and arrows, and you'd be able to live statistically 500 years. Even then, it doesn't mean you're going to die then. It means that you're going to eventually, statistics are going to catch up to you, and you might make different life history decisions again. You know, maybe 1 in 2 million chance of going down in a plane. You know, that'll catch up to you eventually, right? You know, doing kite surfing. I mean, you're gonna redo the math when you actually have health. Some people say we'll get too more conservative. Well, in some ways we'll get more conservative. In some ways we'll take more risks too.
Sure.
So I think there's a trade-off. So I'm a net optimist on the things that this will enable. And this is not the end of death. I think that was the answer to your question. There will always be slings and arrows of life.
Right. Interesting. But the concept of basically becoming too old to function and dying in your sleep for no cause kind of goes by the wayside. And it really is this idea of, okay, a sling and arrow gets me and I didn't have the capacity, homeostatic capacity to deal with it. Interesting.
Yeah, and along the way,
Very
nature gives you enough pain to not fight it. So when you talk to old people, they're kind of ready to give up, but what we are not giving them enough credit is that they've suffered for so long.
Sure.
So if you're actually healthy, you wouldn't be so accepting of the decline and the exit.
Right.
But it's like nature creates its own little Stockholm syndrome. You start to embrace this idea of I'm going to age out, and then I'm okay with it. I've been blown away how many people say, no, actually I prefer to die right now, right? Like, that's awful. How much current aging robs people of their humanity, their relationships, their functional capacity, their mental capacity, you know, everything, right? If you actually gave high levels of function back, I think people would be able to liberate themselves from the Stockholm syndrome, where they've essentially embraced their enemy.
Yeah. Wow. Thanks for that. I've always wondered about, like, it's just this very clear idea of how longevity could actually be implemented. I mean, right now a lot of people are talking about it, but it's always been, to me at least, a bit unclear as to what exactly was being discussed. Different ways of treating metabolic pathways, different ways. There's all these different angles on it, but that's at least a very clear vision of how it could affect us as a society. That's very helpful. So I know you do a lot of investing as well, and so one of the things I was wondering is, we have a lot of scientists that are trying to figure out how to take their insights and turn them into companies in real human value, right, and create change in the world. What are, you've been investing since what, 89 or something, the 1990s?
I'm not that old. 98.
98. I'm sorry.
I'm the one that's dyslexic.
The firm Palo Alto Investors was started in
exactly.
89. I confused that. But yeah, so
we have firm longevity.
Yeah, that's right. Firm longevity, which is always a good thing.
Right.
So in your career, are there patterns you've seen that you can lead to some advice? 2 or 3 pieces of advice for scientists trying to become entrepreneurs?
First of all, I have something specific to science, and I'm just more general perspectives on how to get started. So one of the challenges in the ecosystem of funders and fundees is that it's a closed loop system. So the field kind of has to exist for people to get funding, and the funding has to be there for the field to exist. So it's a circularity. So these closed loops are good in some ways, but it also prevents outlier innovation. So I'm really interested in outlier innovation, where there's no demand for this among the funders, like the venture folks, private interests, and public interests. So how do you get a field started, right? And longevity is a classic example. You can't run longevity trials, so therefore there's no FDA regulatory pathway, therefore there's no venture funding. So how do you start something new? So I think those are the most interesting ones. I mean, you can do this in IndieBio too, where you can spark something where there actually is no marketplace for it, but it's something that's really valuable. So I think those are, to me, the most amazing ideas, something that people aren't looking for.
Yeah, we saw that in Cell Ag, actually.
Is that right?
So Memphis Meats, Clara Foods, the whole idea of producing food from cellular factories instead of animal factories started in IndieBio.
Yep, exactly. And that's where I think the private interest can be a little bit ahead of public interest to drive that kind of innovation. So I think what you're doing in IndieBio is great. This is actually the answer to the question you're asking. But now, in terms of the skills that I find that very successful entrepreneurs have, in addition to what is commonly talked about. So I'm just going to focus on a few that are, I think, under-heralded relative to other things. So the first thing is being a seer. So the human mind really shuts down at 12. There's a reason why we go from a listening sensory being to a projector being. Your mind literally switches at puberty. Again, to me, this is an adaptation that's turned into a maladaptation in the modern world. So most people after age 12 cannot actually see the opportunities that are in front of them. So the good news is you can just essentially choose to be a seer again. This, by the way, is why it's hard to learn language and learn how to play violin. All these skills are harder to learn. This is also the reason why I think medical school should be pushed underneath age 12, because I think we teach medical school too late. Let me just stay on this topic for a second, because I think it's, when I think about all my backup plans on longevity, because I don't know if we're going to solve it. It seems so unlikely. It's fun, but to really solve the 21st century healthcare as a problem, I think we need to democratize health education. I think it is not a good thing that only 10,000 doctors get a medical degree. To me, that's an artifact of history. We used to think about it as a guild, so therefore we kept it limited. In fact, if you read the original Hippocratic Oath, it actually says, make sure you don't tell anybody else the trade. Well, now that we're in the healthcare century and the demand is rising, I think it's insane not to make health education a primary education for everyone. So just like I think math and English are core skills, I think health should be a core skill. So how do you get that to be a core skill everywhere? How do you make it a core curriculum for everybody? So that's problem number one. Problem two is I think you have to teach it when they're young, because again, you can't teach somebody how to speak French fluently after age 12. So if you take it in college, it's too late. So if you want health fluency, I don't think you should teach it when people are 22 right now, I think we should teach it at age 9. I'm going to give you an example after example where little kids pointing something out about the healthcare system that nobody in the healthcare system can see. In fact, let me give you that example. My son, when he was 9 years old, I have food allergies and I've got EpiPens. And I talked to all these scientists in the food allergy field and learned lots of interesting things. But he said, Dad, maybe you just can't make it an epinephrine. So rather than framing it as an immune disease, and we think about food allergies as an immune disease, epinephrine is not an immune hormone, it's a neural hormone. It's a neurophysiological hormone. So, and that's because he didn't have medical education. He could see the fact that that's what works. So, I talk to folks at the internet. Yeah, exactly. It's so obvious, right? Because kids can see. They can learn French. They can see the problems. So I talked to folks at the NIH, and there was no RFP for this. Again, it's a closed loop. There's no funding. There's no entrepreneurship. There's no science going on. So we just funded our own science project at Stanford and started measuring the epinephrine response. It's probably the best way to characterize it of patients who are prone to anaphylaxis from food. I'm going to, since your audience is technical, I'll just describe briefly. Essentially what happens is, the study we ran was, when you inhale, it suppresses the vagal response. So you get mild tachycardia, your heart rate goes up. At every in-breath, your heart rate goes up. At every exhale, your heart rate goes down because the vagal tone rises. And that excursion is typically like 30 beats per minute. Every breath. We have no idea this is changing, right? Because we have no, we don't measure biology four-dimensionally, we just measure it three-dimensionally. So four-dimensionally, you see this, undulation of heart rate every breath. In these kids with food allergies, when they exhale, because there's no sympathetic response or insufficient sympathetic response, the heart rate drops to 30. That excursion is 80 beats per minute. Absolutely stunning. It was like seeing data from Mars. These kids cannot mount their own sufficient sympathetic response. So this to me is why 100 million Americans have allergies, but this 1 million are prone to anaphylaxis where, because normally when your airway's tightening, you increase your own sympathetic tone through epinephrine to open it up. There's the natural feedback loop. Here, to see these people have uncompensated vagal bias, where they have sustained vagal crisis, where just a little bit of epinephrine will bring them back, is a gap in homeostatic capacity.
Interesting.
And so, we ran a second study at Stanford that we funded, looking at kids undergoing anaphylaxis. They go into heart block. There's just all this amazing stuff that we're learning. But when I look back, it all started with a 9-year-old but no medical education.
Right.
So now imagine arming 1 million 9-year-olds per year with free medical education. And I think medical education, medical school can be taught in 6 months. Not the clinical years, but the 2 years of book learning can be compressed into 6 months. The only reason I think it takes 2 years is because we teach them too late. Again, it's like with French. As a 9-year-old to pick it up in 6 months.
Sure.
Furthermore, I think if you ask professors to teach to a 9-year-old, I think it'll force them to think more simply. I think they themselves will become better scientists, forcing to explain it to a 9-year-old. So I think everybody will win if we decided that medical school should be a core curriculum for everybody.
Yeah, that's very interesting. And also I think people will be much less afraid of medicine or their own bodies or just understanding, oh, the doctor said this. Yeah. I don't know what that means, right? I see it all the time. There's this kind of just innate fear of that language even.
I think that's unfair.
You know?
I mean, even PhDs have to ask a medical doctor friend for advice. I think that's, health inequality starts with inequality of health education. I think this should be available to everybody. I think we should democratize it. And you don't have to convince the Department of Education, just put it all online, put all the medical school online, but reteach it to a 9-year-old. All the best teachers will get all the followers, and then you now have, the backup plan become the primary plan.
Yeah. That's amazing. Really, I mean, fundamentally amazing ways of thinking, Joon. I think it's really opened my eyes to thinking about old or long-standing problems and completely new paradigms or new ways, and new solutions then come from it. I think that's one of the things that we see from the great founders that come through IndieBio. The ones that separate, the really great ones, are the ones that have seen an old problem in a new way. Exactly how you're speaking about, like cardiovascular disease or education or things like that. It's like having the courage to be able to say it, I think is important. And I applaud your courage to be able to take a stand, to think differently in a public setting.
Well, I think what you guys are doing is amazing. Even though it's starting at like this biology level, because I know you have a biology background, whatever we learn as a community at this order will help us solve social problems too, because everything's a fractal. So whatever we learn in terms of autoimmune disease and biology will help us deal with the social autoimmune disease we have right now. And we have social immunity going on. You can see it on social media. So I think the benefits of solving these really interesting problems, so not only going up to the social level, but you can probably even get down to the molecular level. We'll probably rethink how genetics work. Because we can see it at the biology level. So I think these things are lens into other strata of life. So that's why I love the potential of what's happening in the modern era to really help us reorganize the problems, get down to the first order problems, and even like outside of biology, like even technical stuff. I mean, the way we are going to eventually implement blockchain, I think there's a lot to be learned from biology. Yeah. Biology was the original blockchain. DNA was the original blockchain. We just decided we can't have this, ever inflating block size. So instead of recording all transactions, we recorded the net result of all transactions in a distributed fashion with complete distributed decentralized readouts. That's essentially what DNA is. The DNA is the inverse image of the trauma of all of our foreruncles and
that's a good way to put it. Yeah, right? Absolutely.
So, because the current blockchain, I understand what they're trying to do, but there's other systems that have been dealing with this for eons. Yeah. So I think there's a lot to be learned just by paying attention to biology and how it's worked. It's it's sort of like archaeology on how life and nature has been built.
Very cool. Well, we're unfortunately out of time. I could speak with you for another 2 hours easily. So, maybe we'll have you back soon for another round. But thank you so much for sharing your insights and wisdom. And you have some incredibly audacious and ambitious plans. And I really hope that they all are seen through to the end, because I think society can really benefit from it. So thank you so much.
And thanks for having me, Arvind.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks.